Write down the number 1049. You wrote 1049. 4 symbols, 2 seconds. Now, write it in the system that Europe used for over 1,000 years. MXLIX. 5 symbols, none of them intuitive, each one requiring knowledge of a system so cumbersome that multiplying 2 large numbers in it is an ordeal that takes a trained specialist several minutes. Now try to multiply MXLIX by XXXVII without converting to the system you actually think in. You can't. Not quickly. Not intuitively. Not without a counting board, a trained hand, and years of practice. You think in Hindu-Arabic numerals. You have always thought in Hindu-Arabic numerals. The 10 digits, 0 through 9. The place value system that gives each digit a different meaning depending on its position. The mathematics that makes modern science, modern finance, modern computing, and modern civilization possible. These are so embedded in your cognition that you cannot imagine thinking without them. But Europe refused them. For 300 years after they were introduced, the most powerful institutions on the continent fought to keep them out. Not because they didn't work, because they worked too well. And the thing that made them work, the single innovation that separated them from every number system that came before, was a concept so dangerous that the church called it demonic and the city of Florence made it illegal. The concept was nothing. The number was 0. And the story of how it was suppressed is the story of who gets to own the tools of thought. The deeper I went into that story, the more I found that the resistance to 0 wasn't ignorance. It was strategy, and the strategy has fingerprints. Start with what Europe was using before 0 arrived, because what it was using tells you what 0 threatened. Roman numerals have no 0, they have no place value. The symbol V always means 5, whether it stands alone or sits inside MCMLXVI. The system is additive and subtractive. You stack symbols. You combine them according to rules. And the result is a notation that can record numbers but cannot easily manipulate them. You can write a number in Roman numerals. Performing arithmetic with them is a different matter entirely. For over 1,000 years, this was not considered a limitation. It was considered the system. European calculation was performed not on paper, but on counting boards, physical devices with columns of grooves or lines along which tokens were moved back and forth. The counting board was the calculator. The Roman numerals were the display. The actual mathematics happened in the hands of the operator, in the physical manipulation of tokens across a surface. And here's the critical detail. The operators were specialists. The men who used counting boards were members of professional guilds. They were the Abbasists, and they controlled European commerce. Every merchant who needed a sum calculated, every tax collector who needed a figure verified, every banker who needed an account balanced went to an Abbasist. The guild held a monopoly on numerical competence, and the monopoly was protected by the system's complexity. Roman numerals and counting boards were difficult. They required training, and that training was the guild's product. This raises a simple but critical question. What happens to a guild that controls calculation when someone introduces a system that makes calculation accessible to anyone with a pen? The answer arrived in 1202. A merchant's son from Pisa named Leonardo, later known as Fibonacci, published a book called Liber Abaci, the Book of Calculation. Fibonacci had grown up in North Africa, where his father ran a customs office for Pisan traders in the port city of Bugia in modern Algeria. There, the young Leonardo had studied under Arab mathematicians, and the Arabs had something that Europe did not. They had 0, not their own invention. They had received it from India, where the concept of 0 as a number, not just a placeholder, but a full mathematical entity with its own arithmetic rules, had been developed over centuries. The Indian mathematician Brahmagupta, writing in 628 CE, had published the first known rules for arithmetic with zero. 0 plus a number equals the number. 0 times a number equals 0. A number minus itself equals 0. These rules, which seem obvious to you because you grew up inside the system they made possible, were revolutionary. They meant that nothing was a number, that absence had a value, that the void could be counted. The knowledge traveled westward through the Islamic world. The Persian mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm, wrote a treatise in the 9th century describing the Indian numeral system, including zero, in terms that Arab and eventually European scholars could understand. Fibonacci brought it to Italy, and in 1202 he laid it on Europe's desk. Europe recoiled. The Church called Hindu-Arabic numerals demonic symbols of the Arabs, not because the mathematics was flawed, because the concept they carried was theologically dangerous. In Aristotelian philosophy, which the medieval Church had adopted as the foundation of its intellectual framework, the void could not exist. Nature abhors a vacuum. Emptiness was impossible. And yet here was a number that represented exactly that. Nothing, a circle on a page that meant absence, a symbol for the void that Aristotle said was impossible, and that the Church said only God could create, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. In 1299, nearly a century after Fibonacci published Liber Abaci, the city of Florence issued an ordinance banning Hindu-Arabic numerals from official documents and commercial accounting. The stated reason was fraud prevention. The digit 0 could be forged into a 6 or a 9. The digit 1 could be altered into a 7. The new numerals were too easy to manipulate on paper. The stated reason was a mask. The real reason was economic. The old counting board methods were controlled by established guilds. A system that replaced the counting board with a pen and a piece of paper. A system that any literate merchant could learn in weeks. Threatened the professional class that had controlled European arithmetic for centuries. The Abbasists didn't just resist zero, they lobbied against it. They argued that the new system was unreliable, susceptible to fraud, inferior to the physical certainty of tokens on a board. They fought to preserve their monopoly by preserving the system that required their expertise. The silence was deafening, because the battle between the Abbasists and the Algorists, the name given to those who adopted the new Hindu-Arabic system, lasted for over 200 years. In Germany, printed images from the 15th century show the two factions literally facing off, the Abbasist with his counting board on one side and the Algorist with his written numerals on the other, while the figure of arithmetic, personified as a woman, judges between them. The images were not allegorical. They documented a real, bitter, centuries-long struggle over who would control the tools of calculation. The merchants won. The advantages of Hindu-Arabic numerals in commerce were too great to suppress forever. By the 14th century, Italian trading houses were using the new system for their account books. In 1494, Luca Pacioli published his Summa de Arithmetica, which described double-entry bookkeeping, the method that balances debits and credits systematically, a method that would have been nearly impossible without positional notation and zero. Modern accounting was born, the guild's monopoly was broken, and the system that had been banned in Florence 2 centuries earlier became the foundation of European finance. But here's the thread nobody follows. Because the European resistance to zero is only half the story. The other half is what happened to the civilizations that had zero before Europe did. The Maya independently invented zero around 350 CE, over 8 centuries before Fibonacci brought it to Italy. The Mayan zero was not borrowed from India. It was not transmitted through the Islamic world. It was developed independently in a mathematical tradition that was, in many respects, more sophisticated than anything Europe possessed at the time. The Mayan long count calendar, the most precisely engineered timekeeping system ever built by a pre-industrial civilization, required zero as a structural necessity. Without it, their base 20 positional number system could not function. The Maya didn't just use zero. They built their civilization's relationship to time around it. The evidence suggests something much larger than a mathematical coincidence. Because here's what happened to the Mayan mathematical tradition. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they brought with them Franciscan friars whose mission was to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. In July 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa, operating under the authority of the Catholic Church, ordered the destruction of thousands of Mayan codices, the bark paper books that contained the accumulated mathematical, astronomical, historical, and ritual knowledge of the Mayan civilization. De Landa wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and, as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all. We burned them all. Thousands of books, centuries of accumulated knowledge. The mathematical tradition that had independently invented zero, that had built the most precise calendar in the ancient world, that had developed a number system whose sophistication rivaled anything that the civilization burning the books had produced. 4 Mayan codices survived. 4 out of thousands, and none of the 4 is a mathematical text. The mathematical records of the civilization that invented zero over a millennium before Europe accepted it were deliberately, systematically, and almost completely destroyed by the civilization that had banned zero from its own accounting a century earlier. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A system of knowledge is independently developed by a non-European civilization. The system is superior by any measurable standard. The European institution encounters it, rejects it, and then destroys the records of the civilization that created it. The Aztecs knew the tomato was food. Europe called it poison for 200 years. The yogis mapped the nasal cycle 3,000 years ago. Western medicine dismissed it as mysticism. The Maya invented 08 centuries before Europe accepted it. The Spanish burned the books that contained the proof. I want to pause here and ask something that isn't usually asked. What was in the codices that were burned? Because the 4 surviving Mayan codices contain astronomical tables of extraordinary precision. The Dresden Codex includes a Venus table that predicts the planet's cycle to within 2 hours over 500 years. If 4 surviving books contain that level of mathematical sophistication, what was in the thousands that were burned? What calculations? What astronomical observations? What mathematical techniques? What applications of the zero that the Maya had been using for over a millennium? We will never know. The records were burned, the knowledge was erased, and the civilization that burned them was the same civilization that had banned zero from its own official documents 1 century earlier and 2 centuries later, would build its entire economic and scientific system on the number it had tried to suppress. The deeper I went, the more I found that zero's journey from dangerous to indispensable followed a path that every suppressed knowledge system in my research has followed, rejected by the institution, adopted by the merchant, resisted by the guild, accepted when the economic advantage became undeniable, and never at any point credited to the civilization that created it. We call them Arabic numerals. They're Indian. We credit Fibonacci with introducing them to Europe. He learned them from Arab teachers who had learned them from Indian mathematicians. We teach zero as a European mathematical concept. It was invented independently by the Maya in the Americas and by mathematicians in India, and both civilizations' records were destroyed or marginalized by the European institution that eventually adopted the concept as its own. I don't have a complete theory. I have a question that multiplies the deeper I look. Why did Europe resist a demonstrably superior number system for 300 years after it was introduced? Why did the Church call Hindu Arabic numerals demonic? Why did Florence ban them? Why did the Abbasist guilds fight for 2 centuries to preserve a system whose only advantage was that it required their expertise? Why did the Spanish burn the mathematical records of the civilization that had been using zero for over a millennium? Why are the numerals still called Arabic when they're Indian? Why is Fibonacci credited with introducing a system that had been in use across Asia and the Islamic world for centuries before he was born? And the question underneath all the others, the one that sits in the empty circle of the zero itself. What happens when a concept that represents nothing threatens everything? What happens when a number that means absence threatens the institutions that depend on presence, on authority, on the controlled complexity that keeps the guild in business and the church in power? What happens when the most powerful idea in mathematics is also the most dangerous? I'll leave you with this. Write down zero. Look at it. A circle, an empty space enclosed by a line, a symbol for nothing that makes everything possible. Without it, no place value, no modern arithmetic, no algebra, no calculus, no computer science, no digital technology, no modern world. The Indians invented it. The Maya invented it independently. The Arabs transmitted it. The church called it demonic. Florence banned it. The Abbasists fought it. The Spanish burned the books of the civilization that had used it longest, and Europe, which resisted it for 300 years, eventually built its entire civilization on top of it. Every number you've ever written, every calculation you've ever performed, every digit on every screen you've ever looked at, all of it rests on a concept that the most powerful institutions of the Western world tried to suppress because a number that meant nothing threatened everything they controlled. They failed, 0 won, but the records of the people who had it first were burned, and the system that replaced every other system on Earth still carries the name of the wrong civilization. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.